Like your attachment, anxious, avoidant, secure, it doesn't remain as that stuck thing. Like it is fluid. It can change and it likely will change if we actually get curious about it and are reflective and put in skills and put in practice.
Hi, I'm Sarah and this is Small Talk. It's not quite a news headline, but it is what the girls are talking about. And today I am here with psychologist Rashida Dungarwalla. I'm so excited to have you here. You are the principal psychologist and founder of Flow State Space. And thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what I wanted to talk about today, what I'm really fascinated by, is the idea of attachment styles. Mm-hmm. And I know they've been done to death online, and it's really what catapulted therapy speak online. Mm-hmm. But I want to talk about it because I think it's something we hear of, we don't necessarily understand, or that we understand but kind of use as a crux in a weird way. So I want to explore that today. Yep. Is it something people bring up with you all the time?
All the time. And I love attachment theory. It's actually a really big part of how I work. I work relationally. I think that most therapists are going to be bringing attachment theory into the room with their clients at some point. But yeah, get asked about it all the time. People wanting to understand what their attachment style is, what their partner's attachment style is, how they're interacting with each other, all these sort of questions.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. I tried to look into sort of where this started. Yeah. And from what I understand, it started back in the 1960s?
Yes, yeah.
John Bowlby.
So John Bowlby, who's the first attachment theorist, so at that time, a lot of the research was around things like the unconscious and turning the unconscious conscious. And he wasn't seeing that there was much research done on attachment theory and on attachment, to primary caregivers and between people.
Isn't that so funny? Because we would think of that now as almost obvious.
And even attachment theory, like to not have had any research done on it in the 60s, like that's not that long ago.
No.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't till the 70s that then there was
Mary Ainsworth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now she looked at testing babies if you took them away and then reintroduced them to their caregivers and see how they react.
Exactly. Yeah. So she came in a decade later and she expanded on John Bowlby's research, and she did this experiment called the strange situation, where essentially she observed these babies and their primary caregiver at that time. It was the 70s, so it was predominantly the mother, and she was observing these babies in the room, going into the room with their mother, then a stranger would enter the room, and then the mother would leave the room and it would just be the stranger and the baby in the room. And then a little bit while after that, the mother would return, and essentially she was observing the baby's reaction at each point. So when they entered the room, when the stranger entered the room, when the mother left the room, and then when the mother returned into the room, to essentially come out with these attachment styles that we know them today. But that was the strange situation experiment that she did to expand on Bowlby's work. And then, as we were talking about just before, it's only pretty recently that we started even considering attachment styles in romantic relationships, because all this previous research was just more like child and primary caregiver, child and parent.
So it was the 70s research that sort of created those three categories of like secure, avoidant, and anxious. So then why did they then even try and relate it to relationships?
Well, we understand attachment theory to be something that is within all relationships, and essentially the attachment style that you maybe enter a romantic relationship with will have some origins potentially in your attachment between you and your primary caregiver. However, what we know with adult relationships and romantic relationships is that they can shift and change, like based on the partner, based on, so many other factors. Whereas previously, with all this previous attachment theory, it was like a stuck attachment that you developed, and then that was it. Whereas now we know, you can fluctuate, it can shift, it can change. Even within the same relationship, it can shift.
I know people would already know it, but can you just explain the three attachment styles and sort of what the key traits to each of them are?
Yeah, so we've got secure, anxious, sometimes known as anxious ambivalent, and then avoidant. And then we talked about a fourth, disorganized. So Secure is essentially someone that it's not that they're not affected by what's going on with the other partner or partners. It's that they're going to have this sort of safe harbor within themselves to know that things are likely going to be okay. They've got a sense of like worthiness in what they're deserving of. They're not going to be totally thrown by what's going on with the relational dynamic because they've got that secure grounding base. And then the anxious attachment is someone that's, I guess, more prone to just anxiety in general, but can end up having this preoccupation in what's going to happen and all the what ifs and all the anxieties in what could happen between them and the person that they're with or the people that they're with, and sometimes preoccupied with fears of abandonment or neglect or something really bad's going to happen. And then someone with an avoidance style would be more prone to be like self-reliant and sometimes a bit fearful of those intimate connections or relationships, and so would prefer to just be on their own, like have maybe realized or had experiences where relationships have not been a safe place. So it's safer to be alone.
I think my question with that is how, you know, say you have grown up in an environment that maybe didn't make you feel the safest. What makes you more like predispositioned to be avoidant rather than anxious about that?
Right. So if we go back to this like strange situation experiment, which was between these babies and mothers, what ended up causing Mary Ainsworth to come up with the 3 was the way that the baby would respond. She didn't just observe them in this experiment. She'd been observing them for 6 months plus. So she had all this insight outside of that experiment, how the mother or the parents were interacting with that child. So if the parents were sort of getting it wrong essentially in what that child needed, the child would learn that there's more trust in just myself, right? I don't know what I'm going to get here. And so I'm going to end up just relying on myself and having more trust in myself. So maybe the child needed a certain thing. The parent would either tell them that they're okay, they don't need that thing, they're going to be all right on their own. And then they'd develop this idea that, okay, well then my primary caregiver is not going to be supportive to me when I need it. So I'm just better off on my own. Whereas someone that's more anxious might have got a bit inconsistent support from the primary caregiver. So at some times they might have been there and they might have got it right in what that child needed. Other times they might have been not purposefully, but just not there to support in the way that the child needed. So then that child ends up becoming quite anxious and not knowing what they're going to get. Everything feels a bit inconsistent.
Do you think it is the majority that are secure, or are the majority not secure?
From my understanding, actually, the majority in relationships are secure.
Really?
Yeah, which is surprising.
Really
You're surprised.
So surprised by that.
Why are you surprised?
Well, I feel like like even in friendship groups, say someone has a problem with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever, you'd be like, well, she just sounds like she's more anxious, or he's just an avoidant, like, whatever it is. Everyone seems to have something.
Yeah, it kind of reduces it down though, right?
Yes.
Because if we do just treat it almost like a label, we're not then getting curious as to what has actually caused that person to potentially have that attachment style or respond in that way. All of the styles really are in the name of protection, are in the name of wanting to be safe. And if we just reduce it down to like that person's anxious, that person's avoidant, we don't get curious into understanding, well, first of all, what's leading to them, you know, likely unconsciously choosing that response, choosing that way of behaving in the relationship, and, you know, what's actually going on under the surface.
I feel like this is something I struggle with attachment theory a little bit, is sometimes someone will be not the best partner because they're super avoidant or because they're overly anxious or whatever it is. And that's when you start psychoanalyzing other people and you go, okay, so why are they like that? And then you'll look at their childhood and you meet their family and you go, what's their problem?
I can't figure it out.
Like, I can't figure it out. So there's so much emphasis on that early childhood to explain why someone is the way they are.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not always as clear as someone who's like, oh, okay, well, this happened to them and that now makes sense that they would react this way in later life.
Yeah, because we kind of want it to be very neatly boxed and we want the clarity and we want it to be something very straightforward. But I mean, human relation and attachment theory, it's a pretty complex thing. And actually it can shift based on the relationship you had with, if you had, you know, if you were coming from a heteronormative relationship, like the attachment with with the mother could look very different to the father.
Yes.
And then that can influence how you're going to future relate to people. And then on top of that, if we're talking about adult relationships, you've potentially had other adult relationships and significant relationships that are going to also influence how you end up attaching to people. It's not all just going to be completely related to how you related or attached to your primary caregivers.
I mean, what's funny about attachment theories, I think when I was trying to look into it, predominantly COVID lockdown is when therapy speak became really big online. And it was taking these complicated theories and making them like bite-sized 1-minute videos of like how to tell if you're anxiously attached, how to tell if you're avoidant, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big part of the problem, which is when they were trying to explain it, they would only really be able to explain the childhood element to it. And then you don't really take the time to consider like, okay, but what else is influencing this?
Yeah, who else have I been in relationship with that has left me with an experience that becomes a reference point to the next relationship that I'm in, right? Because our brain sort of does. It goes back to these reference points of what it was to relate to someone. Sometimes then we're just doing this repeat pattern of behavior without actually getting curious as to what's going on between me and this person right here and now. Everything's getting activated from this historical experiences that we've had.
I think for me personally, I remember I went to therapy for the first time and I'd never really been in a proper relationship. I almost did it preventative. Like I was like, I actually don't know what I'm going to be like in a relationship. And I was speaking to this therapist and they were like, oh, you probably might show up as quite disorganized. Just based on your childhood experiences, it's probably going to show up like that. And it was really interesting that in the relationships or experiences I've had since then, it hasn't been very consistent. Like sometimes I have been quite secure, but then like in a recent relationship, super anxious. And then I surprised myself with that because I didn't feel very aligned to who I felt I was, like identity-wise.
Yeah.
It's just very confusing.
Well, it is confusing because I think if we assume that it's something that we're stuck with, like one attachment style is the attachment style we have for life, we could get quite confused then when we feel like we're showing up through the lens of a different attachment style in the next relationship that we're in. But that's what we understand now about attachment theory, is that in adult relationships, it can change. It can even change from the beginning of that relationship towards, the middle or the end of that relationship.
Which is what happens usually.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't start off anxious, I would hope. Like,
No. Well, sometimes for some people, yes.
And it's also, I wonder if different people or different relationships was just triggering different childhood wounds or memories or whatever it is. And then that sort of brings that out of you.
It's like this perfect storm scenario that I talk about a lot with people in session, is that sometimes there's just multiple factors at play in both of your lives going on that's going to result in you feeling like, you're not as secure or stable as you once were. But it might have nothing to do with your attachment styles. You might both be very securely attached, but you've just got all these other stresses at play in your own individual lives that end up coming in and causing you to both feel like, you don't have that safe harbor anymore. And then we want to be mindful of not mistaking it for all of a sudden I've got now this anxious attachment style or they're becoming avoidant. Maybe there's just other stuff going on in each of your lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's causing stress.
Can I ask as well, can you explain what disorganized attachment is?
Disorganized is where you have potentially had that inconsistent caregiving or support potentially. So you've had maybe a parent that was really available at times and then, not available at other times. And so you don't really know what you're in for and you're attempting to predict all the time. I guess all of the attachment styles you're attempting to predict, because again, we do not like, we like to be familiar and everything to be predictable. But with the disorganized style, you may have been in for more unpredictability. It can feel pretty scary. You don't know what you're going to be in for.
Yeah. I think it's similar to when I've spoken to people that identify more with anxious.
Yeah.
Is that trying to predict always, and it's got that like eldest daughter quality to it as well of being very overly in tune to the people around you and how they might be feeling because you're trying to constantly make sure you're not going to be in a stressful
Protect
situation.
Yourself. Yeah.
Which kind of then leads to, and I think if that's what you've known as a kid, if like someone's been unpredictable, you're constantly super aware of their mood or whatever it is. Sometimes it feels quite safe to then pursue people that might be more avoidant. And do you see that a lot of like anxious people and avoidant people almost seeking out whatever the opposite of them is?
Yeah, anxious people who are feeling like a safety on their own, getting attracted maybe to someone that is anxiously attached or more leaning towards being anxiously attached, but who in the initial stages of the relationship is not showing up as an anxious person. Because I think that that's also what's been harmful in the way that we are told we should come across when we're initially dating people.
Oh, you have to act like you don't care.
Yeah, act like you don't care, act like, you know, you don't really even want this person. That's going to be quite conflicting to who you actually might be if you're more prone to feeling anxious. And so then you're going to show up in this way that's actually not likely authentic to who you really are or what might come later down the track. And then you're going to get attached to the person. You're going to potentially enter a relationship. And then you're going to start feeling worried or maybe more prone to that anxiety. And the avoidant person's going to say,
well, that's not what I signed up for.
Yes.
I've been hoodwinked.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's going to likely activate more of their avoidance. You know, this person's actually needing too much from me. And if that avoidant person has come from previous experiences where that is risky, that's like threatening to their independence, they're going to want to shut the whole thing down, which is going to cause that anxious person to feel more anxious. And then it turns into this whole, you know, push-pull situation.
I mean, you know, I feel like a lot of people would relate to almost that exact scenario, but how would you begin to recognize that stuff in yourself, especially those early stages of dating?
Well, if you have the opportunity to get into therapy, so then you can do it. So then you can actually, based on the individual experience, right?
Because I feel like part of it is you don't actually realize you're displaying it.
You don't know that you're actually engaging in that behavior. Yeah. Again, being curious to, is this something that I've noticed in other relationships that I've been in? Is this something that I'm hearing from my partner? Like, are they telling me that they think something's up? And rather than maybe becoming defensive about that, or getting curious to, could this be related to something else that has happened? Like, am I trying to protect myself from something? And do I even have something I need to protect myself from? Or is the relationship itself the thing that I've started to view as a risk that I'm trying to protect myself from? Or is it that all relationships actually hold a lot of risk and we're going to have to face it if we want to be in relationship with others? Because I think that's a big factor, right? We want to just avoid any sort of discomfort, any sort of tension, any sort of having to like look inwards. But that's a big part of relationships.
I found, and this is what I sometimes, especially in my like earlier 20s, I would come across quite avoidant, but it was actually I just got so anxious that I became avoidant.
And what would you do?
Distance, probably. Oh, that's when you start to play games.
Because you got your armor up and you're thinking that that's the only way to keep yourself safe. But what you're also doing is just shutting everyone out, keeping everyone at arm's length.
And then when you do let someone in, you're like, okay, well, I've made this decision. And that's when I surprised myself with being more anxious. Because I was like, oh my God, I've picked very carefully. So if I've picked carefully and picked wrong, this is going to be so embarrassing.
Where you start doing all that predicting or that what ifing or the catastrophizing.
Because the other thing and talking about that with like recognizing patterns, when I first looked into attachment theory, I actually didn't look at it first within the lens of relationships.
Oh, yeah.
I was actually more interested in terms of like understanding family better.
Yeah.
And I know attachment theory for relationships gets a lot of airtime and it is really important. But what would you say about understanding it in terms of trying to understand your own family better as well?
Yeah, well, sometimes if there's intergenerational trauma or intergenerational patterns, we can understand why our parents or our primary caregivers were maybe unable to provide us the support that we needed as a child. So then we can, rather than, because I think a lot of people that I work with, they're hesitant to actually bring their parents into it as being cause for the attachment style they end up developing. Yeah. Like they don't want to blame their parents. They're like, they were doing their best. They were doing everything that they could. And this isn't about blaming anyone. It's just more about acknowledging that I mean, also for a lot of first-time parents, like there are going to be times where they're trying to support their child, they're trying to provide them what they think that they need, but they might not get it right all the time, right?
Oh my God, one of the most engaged episodes we ever did was sibling order theory.
Oh, yeah.
And like how different youngest child experience would be from the first.
Yeah, I tell that to a lot of my clients that essentially if you do have siblings, you're getting parented by different parents, especially if there's a large age gap, right? If you've got a 10-year age gap between you and your sibling, imagine how much your parents are going to change in those 10 years. Like they're going to be different people. If you imagine yourself from now to 10 years ago, you were likely a totally different person.
It's so true and it's so confusing. One of the best examples is actually my mum. She's the eldest of 7.
Yeah.
And there's like 25 years or whatever it is between her and her youngest.
Wow.
And they could not have had more different upbringings because it's almost, you can't even, different houses, different locations.
2 decades.
The youngest was predominantly more, not like an only child, but had like one other sibling in the house, whereas she had, 5. And it's so funny because they all love each other so much, but you can almost see there's like that level of, and they'll say it to each other, like almost resentment that they had the same parents, but
such different experiences. Yeah, this is not about necessarily like blaming anyone or that your parents were intentionally doing things to cause you to have this avoidant or anxious style. And this is another thing. We want to, as humans, as a species, we want to try and put things into a binary of being good or bad. And there is a lot out there, especially with social media, talking about attachment styles, of certain styles being better or worse than the other. They just are. It's just how we all the time are coming back to trying to protect ourselves.
It's all survival
from risk.
instinct,
It's survival
right?
instincts.
And I think it's funny that you said as well, like, people are really stressed not to put blame on parents, but I also found it was really interesting to try and understand what my parents would have been, for example, is more of it's like that same way for like, if we can understand, then there's actually a lot more give in how you view them as also human, and they've also had childhoods, and like what were their childhoods like, and how does that inform their parenting, etc. So I feel like it explains why they do the things they do.
100%. But I think what's also interesting in the research is that it wasn't until I think the 60s that the emotional needs of a child started to be seen as something important that parents and primary caregivers needed to focus on.
Yeah.
Right? Like for a long time there, it was around the child being housed and fed and financial support, and these emotional needs weren't even considered. And if we're talking about this John Bowlby only coming in at the 60s to start understanding like what are these attachments and how do they inform like our future development and how we relate and how we operate in the world, so still to this day, there are parents and primary caregivers who are not considering the child's emotional needs that are going to end up affecting like what their attachment style is and how they're going to relate to other people. So, it's a big job, obviously, that parents have, but those emotional needs are really integral.
Yeah. It's so funny that's like a kind of new phenomenon.
Yeah. Something from the recent years.
I think even with family, so my brother and I would be fairly close in age, would have had very similar upbringings and experiences. And like, yes, there's still the eldest, but we could not be more different in how we've handled or like both
your relationships.
Yeah, like it's how we show up in our relationships. And I would say for the most part, we would have had that same foundation, which obviously is just leaning into the fact that like there are so many other influences.
Yes, we're not in a vacuum, just us and our parents. We've got so many other factors.
And then if we do look more at relationships, also deciding how this is not only how you navigate how you love, but also how you handle conflict as well.
Yes. So in conflict and in tension, when if we remember that we do not like difficult emotions, and often when there's a tension point or there's a challenge in the relationship or there's a conflict in the relationship, we don't know, especially if we're in the early stages of a relationship, how our partner or partners manage conflict. And so sometimes that's what causes, I think, people to want to grasp onto something like the attachment style. Like, this is going to help me figure out what's going on here and how we can maybe overcome it. But sometimes it can be the cause of the conflict, the attachment styles, and both of your styles clashing with each other. But knowing that they can change, and then it's our responsibility to actually vocalize that to our partner.
Yeah,
hey,
which is the hardest thing.
I think I just got activated. I think I was feeling really anxious. I was, catastrophizing. I thought this might happen. And I just want to let you in to knowing that. That's a scary thing to do.
Well, it's really tough because that is the obvious thing to do would be to A, recognize it in yourself, then B, communicate that. But I think when you are avoidant or anxious, even getting those words out would be feeling impossible.
It can. And I think in therapy, like I do a lot of role play and we actually go through what we might want to say or what we might want to do. And because it can be extremely overwhelming in the moment. And when you're so emotionally activated in the moment, we're not thinking straight. We are, again, we're all those parts of the brain have turned off, essentially. They've gone offline. And so that's when I practice somatically. So we bring ourselves back into the room, we bring ourselves back into the body, and we try and create that pause so that we can actually communicate and verbalize.
I mean, what are some tips for if you're sort of new to trying to implement some of this stuff? Because as much as you'd love to say, I'm feeling look someone in the eye and be like, I'm feeling activated. Sometimes that is almost a step too big a step. Is there little stuff maybe if you need to have conversations doing it side on rather so you're not looking someone in the eye or writing down something
writing
first,
things down
or
can be
stuff is that all common?
That's really good tips. Also, sometimes scheduling in times where we're going to actually check in with each other and doing an actual scheduled check-in so it doesn't feel like it's just landed on us. And then the check-in doesn't have to all just be about things that you've been finding difficult. It can also be sharing with each other things that you've appreciated, but sometimes having that predictability around it if it's a check-in. Sometimes if you do notice yourself we want to get clear on what our warning signs are, that we're getting flooded or that we're getting to that place where we're not going to be able to communicate any longer. And if we start to figure out that, okay, I'm getting that felt experience now, it's indication that I'm probably not going to be able to communicate, just saying, hey, I need a moment. And then just going in another room or going for a little walk or going to get a drink of water, but making sure you return to the conversation. Because some people will use that pause as a chance to then never have to address that thing again. But it's no, let's actually pause, but then return to it when we're both regulated again.
Yeah. And if you are returning to and say that whoever you're with isn't responding really, then... Because I feel like the thing with attachment styles is you're all sort of working towards secure if you're not already there. And if you're with someone else, it's maybe also not secure and you're trying to work on secure and they're not also doing that. What are your tips for if you're also just...
Well, that's difficult, right? If they're unaware and they're not necessarily willing to want to self-reflect, then sometimes you can continue to reach this sort of roadblock. Because you can be doing all of this work and you can be doing all of this self-reflection into what's going on for you. But if the other person's unable to meet you in the middle, you can find yourself in that cyclical pattern then of feeling like you continue to reach this obstacle point. But again, I would say that if we think that the relationship and the person is someone we actually want to continue with, then I would encourage to, just bring it up with them again. And say, hey, I've noticed we keep meeting at this roadblock. What's going on? We're a team. How can we approach it together?
Would you say, kind of off the back of that in the right relationship, you are secure?
No. Well, that's where, I think we want to be able to label relationships as right or wrong. But maybe if you find yourself being able to hold yourself accountable more often and pause and reflect on where the origin of this activation or behavior is coming from, you're headed towards more security.
That you have the space to communicate a little bit more freely.
Yes.
Because that is something you hear a lot that's oh, I feel really relaxed and so it must be this is the right relationship then.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily just because the person that you're with secure or you've now become secure. It might also be because you feel a level of safety in raising difficult things with your partner. Because again, securely attached people, it's not that they're never engaged in any sort of tension or conflict. They're just able to repair from it in a different way to someone that might be more leaning towards anxious or avoidant.
Do you think as well on that is when you find out sort of what attachment style you are, and if it's not secure, do you worry that sometimes people might become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yes, it can become like this self-sabotaging sort of narrative that like, well, that's just me, so this isn't going to work, or writing people off or writing relations off prematurely before we've had an opportunity to actually learn about how each of us are going to cope, how we're going to come together, if we are going to be able to work together as a team, all of those things.
And I wonder if TikTok normalized this in ways, but you'll sort of hear people say, well, I'm anxiously attached because this happened to me. And so if they don't do this, then like this relationship won't work. I find it's interesting language because that is fair, but does that mean you're very like committed to being anxious and not working towards being secure?
Yeah, I get a sense that there's like then this sense of permanence,
Yeah.
which we know through the research it's not, especially in your adult relationships. Like your attachment, anxious, avoidant, secure, it doesn't remain as that stuck thing. Like it is fluid. It can change and it likely will change if we actually get curious about it and are reflective and put in skills and put in practice.
Yeah. And you hear it as well for also putting partners in boxes, being like, oh, he's just so avoidant.
Yeah,
so I'll never expect this from him sort of thing, rather than like, no, I will still expect this.
I think it's attached to avoidance, like our tendency to not want to have to
change
and confront things that are difficult and that are going to take time. We want everything like that, or we want it to be this quick fix, or we want it to just be this, you know, simple, neatly boxed thing that we can attach to. But it's not that straightforward. Like it is a fluid experience, and we have to be able to face, you know, the knowledge that we're going to have to put things in place if we want that change.
Do you find, looking at patterns, does it tend to be that like men are more likely to be avoidant than women?
I actually don't know too much about the gendered differences in the attachment styles. We know that men's emotional needs are less prioritized, that there could be this tendency for them to lean more to avoidance because they are less likely to utilize relationships as a way of regulating. They're more likely to just try and cope with things on their own.
Yeah, more observational than anything. Yeah. But I just think sometimes women are given the space to be that little bit more emotional or anxious or voice those things, whereas that would be pretty discouraged in younger years especially.
For sure. Yeah, socially as well, like in the future relationships post your relationship with your primary caregiver, in your friendships, having space to actually show up in an emotional way, have difficult conversations and then also repair from them. It's likely more happening in female friendships than male friendship.
The other thing I was thinking about was if you are dealing with someone who is super anxious or super avoidant, how much rope do you give them before putting those boundaries in place as well?
You have to get clear on what your limits are. Everyone's line is going to look different, right? So you have to get clear on what you're okay with, essentially, in how many attempts you're willing to allow the relationship to go through before you decide that this is actually no longer working for me. And I think that can be the unhelpful nature of social media in also, you know, putting these attachment styles into good or bad categories. Like I do see a lot out there about people that are prone to being maybe more avoidant, that they're not able to be in relationships. Even that book that made attachment theory quite popular, Attached, I think puts an avoidant attachment style in quite a negative light and almost gives off this idea that people that are avoidantly attached are unable to be in relationship.
Sort of the impression is like avoidant is like emotionally shut off. Whereas it's not necessarily that they're not having emotions. It's
100%.
just that they're not showing them.
Exactly. And the cause gets lost, right? Like it almost, people can simplify it down to this idea that the person doesn't want the relationship. They'd prefer to be alone, but we are relational, pro-social beings. Like we all want to relate and be in relationship. Often what the cause is that the person thinks that it's actually going to hurt too much to allow the person in and relate to them. So I'd rather just be on my own and protect myself. But when they can start learning that it's actually going to be okay, it's safe, they can be in very healthy relationships.
Yeah, it's so funny the different PR for each of those styles.
Yeah.
Because avoidant comes across so heartless.
And then the secure, being seen as someone that's just also not affected in a way, is still affected, just going to feel okay in themselves to know that things will end up being all right.
Because I think it's like an identity thing that gets tied up in relationships. And I think that's sometimes the problem with avoidant and anxious is maybe it's a hyper independence for avoidant, but for anxious, you'll tie up a lot of your sense of worth and belonging in that relationship.
In the relationship.
Whereas secure is kind of that understanding that you will be okay with or without.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Is there anything else on attachment styles that you think is important for people to know that maybe they don't know because of the way it's simplified or spoken about online?
I think just, again, I've said it so many times today, but remaining curious to what else could be going on, right? Like get curious about what the attachment style is and what the relational dynamic in the lens of attachment could be. Don't ignore all the other factors at play. So just don't reduce it all down to an attachment style.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Where can we find you?
You can find me on Instagram, flow.state.space, website. And yeah, would love to hear from you.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.